Continuing reading of the Arabs at war in Afghanistan. This is chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, with the entitlement in chapter 4, the establishment of Sadda camp by Maktab Al Khidamat. In the mid 1986, the Maktab Al Khidamat began looking to create its separate camp for training Arab Afghans, as efforts at other camps had not been particularly successful. The Sadda camp was established after negotiations with Abdul Rasul Sayyaf to host in the area of Sadda controlled by Sayyaf. Most of the areas in Afghanistan were primarily controlled by warring Afghan tribes, and the majority of the land under these warlords was run by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. And if Osama bin Laden wanted to open up a camp, he had to have to go through Sayyaf to do it. What is not known about Maktab al Khidamat, moving of resources to Sadda, was that it had as much to do with Azzam's need for protection as it did with setting up training, meaning Abdullah Yusuf Azzam. Mustafa Hamid, the first training for Arabs alone was in the Sadda camp in the tribal area of Pakistan under Sayyaf's control. And also, as Pakistan was controlled by Afghan leaders with ties to Pakistan ISI. Abdullah Yusuf Azzam sought protection and refuge in Sayyaf's territory after Gulbuddin Hekmatyar made strong threats against him. Hekmatyar was angry with Azzam because he thought Azzam was making propaganda in favor of Sayyaf and financial support of his activities. Burhamin Rabbani, he was angry with Azzam, but unlike Hekmatyar, he did not resort to threats. Both Hekmatyar and Rabbani were angry that Azzam was giving too much money to Sayyaf and not supporting their organizations with anything. Meanwhile, Rabbani and Hekmatyar, especially Hekmatyar, who received the most funding from foreign organizations and the intelligence services, including the British MI6, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the Mahabeth, which is the security services, or the General Intelligence Directorate in Saudi Arabia. Hekmatyar said, I'm going to kill Azzam. He damaged our work. He took over our money. Maktab al Khidamat came to the Mujahideen, and they took our money and behaved freely without asking or consulting us. Sayyaf was angry at Maktab al Khidamat for similar reasons, for not getting enough money and supplies. Now, remember, Maktab al Khidamat catered to Arabs, not necessarily Afghans, who were, like I said, getting money from NGOs, non-government organizations overseas, and the intelligence services. These were greedy people. Although when Sayyaf found out that his competitors did not like what had happened, and that leaders like Hekmatyar had threatened Azzam, Sayyaf told Azzam, take refuge, go to Sadda to my camp, and you will be under my protection. And I think what happened here was Hekmatyar had grown weary of competition. He thought of himself as the leader against the communist fight in Afghanistan because he employed Arabs as well. And Hekmatyar of the Hizb-e-Islami army was separate from, say, the Haqqani network under Jalaluddin Haqqani, who originally brought over Arabs into his network and were trained in guerrilla warfare. People like Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Muhammad Attab, who became the military commanders of al-Qaeda later on. During his security asylum in the Sadda camp, Azzam thought of summoning a group of young Arabs in Peshawar to hold a religious military session under his supervision. That session and others that followed were characterized by religious training, and the military training was weak because military training under Arabs were not considered the best. It was considered the best under, later on, Egyptians that were released from the jails in Egypt after the assassination of Sadat, and also Afghans, who were much more fighting efficient individuals than, say, Arabs. In fact, it was the early days of Sadda, before the arrival of Abu Burham al-Suri. What Azzam created was a mosque and not a training camp. The weakness of this training was evident when Azam took those who had trained at Sadda to coast after the end of the Battle of Zuwar in April of 1986. LF meaning Leah Farrell, who was the author of the book. This is the Brigade of the Humorists. Mustafa Hamid, MH, yes. The Brigade of the Humorists, as the lore goes, was formed from those who had been through early training at Sadda. Azam had put out a mobilization call for them to join in the Battle of Zawar. The brigade's poor levels of organization, as well as their unfamiliarity with the terrain, saw the Afghans decline their participation, with some reports claiming that the brigade was in fact asked to leave the area. The utter failure of their mission led to Abu Hajar al-Iraqi to coin the name Brigade of the Humorists. Leah Farrell had thought the brigade did see action. Mustafa Hamid, no. They were unable to even march in the mountains. That was clear practical proof that training at that time did not work as it should. Maktab Al Khidamat's training fortune soon improved when Abu Burham al-Suri, a Syrian with military experience, took over the management and training at the Sadda camp and began his efforts to improve the quality of the training offered. Mustafa Hamid. The arrival of the Syrian officer Abu Burham in the summer of 1986 resulted in a transformation in the level of training of Arabs at Sadda. This was key because this would later be, which later has a ripple effect at the al-Sadda training camp, the Lion's Den, also known as the base, which is where al-Qaeda came from. Abu Burham was one of the two most important individuals who affected the course of Arab-Afghan training after 1985, when volunteers' numbers began to increase. The other person was Ali Muhammad, an Egyptian-American who worked with Tanzim al-Jihad and al-Qaeda, and we will talk about him later. That's right. You heard that right. Ali Muhammad, the same Ali Muhammad who was involved with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the training of those individuals who helped to make the bomb. The same Ali Muhammad who gave an outline of how to attack U.S. embassies in Africa with their security lapses. And according to the FBI, Ali Muhammad helped train the 9/11 hijackers in hijacking planes. This is the reason why you don't hear of Ali Muhammad anymore, because he probably had a whole lot to say. Because here's a guy who was a military, influential military commander at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, known to the CIA, known to the FBI. Abu Burham was former Ikhwan Muslimin, and among those who emigrated from Syria and the armed revolution against Hafiz al-Assad. Later on, that would have more reverberating effect because the Arabs would be once again funded and given logistical support in Syria during another CIA operation called Timber Sycamore. Regime, and this led to the Arabs taking over Syria, including a terrorist network, that's right, al-Qaeda, under Abu Muhammad al-Jilani. Now, the regime in the early 1980s failed, but Abu Burham was a tough military man. I remember the shock I felt one day when I saw him smiling on another occasion when he was caught hiding his concern for me when he argued against me assuming leadership of a major organization with the Arabs in Gardez in 1992. Abu Burham argued against me leading the operation at a meeting he attended along with Abu Abdullah, that's Osama bin Laden, Abu Hafs, that's Abu Hafs al-Masri, and Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, among others. These are the leaders of al-Qaeda, the early leaders. I misunderstood his stance in the beginning, but he explained in a sincere way that he was concerned for my safety. I did not expect that from him. He said to me that he argued to the others I should not lead the operation because it is difficult to replace him if he is lost. No one had showed such concern for me at any time during the war, with the exception of Jalaluddin Haqqani once in 1979 and again in 1991. And just think, two very important people, al-Suri and Haqqani, had spoken for Mustafa Hamid. The most important work with Abu Burham did outside the training was his completion of the Afghan Jihad Encyclopedia, which Maktab Al Khidamat printed and distributed. This encyclopedia included most of the training courses studied in the camp, or that should have been taught had circumstances allowed. It was a unique work, and no work of its kind or anything similar appeared for that stage of the jihad in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1992. Abu Burhan's participation stretched from 1986 until 1993. Although he stopped working in 92, he continued for a year giving consultation to the young people who took over the management of the Chaldean camping coast. By the way, who was the main trainer at Chaldean? Abu Zubaydah. This is not an Al Qaeda training camp. It was shut down by the Taliban for infighting between Arabs and the Taliban, where training moved after the Sadda camp was closed. On his advice, the camp moved inside Afghanistan when Pakistan began to harass the Arabs and caught a few of them. After that, Abu Burhan left for Sudan, which is where Osama bin Laden had went. Abu Burhan did not participate directly in the famous 1987 Jaji battle, but his students from Sadda participated. He also traveled to Jaji to provide some training there before the battle. Abu Burhan's students trained on some important weapons such as mortars and the rocket launcher, the BM-12, and they received lessons in topography, which made them more skilled in surveillance and direct artillery fire, unconventional warfare, which is what beat the Soviets, which is what beaten back the United States and Afghanistan during the 20-year war after 9/11. Although they were few in number, their participation was vital in that battle. The establishment of Sadda camp reportedly caused significant concerns among some governments, particularly after explosives training was introduced. Now, this is key because this is basically what stopped a lot of the camps, right? So let's make myself disappear. Now, which was introduced later, Palestinian volunteers trained in explosives use and subsequently returned to this knowledge in attacks against Israeli targets, specifically the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, because they had to fight against what? Israeli military. So they got their training from the Arabs at Chaldean because their training was for against Soviet military. These are militants. Well, same thing for Israel. Islamic militants training in explosive training to fight against a standing military. Arab governments were attempting to block the emergence of any serious military training for young Arab volunteers because they feared these youths might carry out armed activities when they returned to their countries, and they did, specifically in Algeria. And then Iraq, of course, Afghanistan after the Soviets left, Libya today, currently in Syria, 10 years ago. Now it's North Africa and Syria and Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia had the greatest fear of this occurring, and because it had a great influence on the government of Pakistan and Afghan organizations, it was able to block early attempts to train Arabs in special camps. The establishment of the, and plus, they also gave blackmail money to these Islamic militants that carried over to the bin Laden era. The establishment of the Sadda camp came as a shock to the Saudi regime because it could not monitor activities at Sadda as closely as it did at Tabi in Peshawar, where early efforts at training had been conducted because the ISI is closer to home there. The Saudi regime had expected more of this red line and that it would be crossed, Leah Farrall. Although training became more sophisticated under Abu Burhan's leadership, the mismanagement of Maktab Al Khidamat continued to impact upon the Sadda camp. It was among the reasons bin Laden sought to establish an independent training location. This was the al-Masri camp. His attempts to do so in 1986 were repeatedly opposed as he was failing to find a suitable location. I wonder whether opposition to bin Laden's plans to establish an independent training location, one attempt at which was to try to start his own camp in the Sadda area, was in part because his own doing, and so eventually a reform effort which might cast others in a bad light. Mustafa Hamid. In the beginning, Abu Abdallah's efforts had strong reform focus, but this came after he saw for himself the conditions at the fronts and that the money was being received by the Maktab Al Khidamat was not reaching where it was needed inside Afghanistan because of the corruption of the Maktab Al Khidamat within the people that were employed there. After he saw the fronts, Abu Abdallah first priority was making sure the money reached them rather than establishing a new training camp. He wanted to separate his work from the Maktab Al Khidamat. And this is where the separation between bin Laden and Abdullah Yusuf began. Because later on, when the Egyptians got involved under Dr. Ayman al Zawahiri and Saif Imam al Sharif and Abu Ubaid al Banshuri, they started whispering into bin Laden's ear that maybe, just maybe, Azam is in the way and that he's not for a rigid military fight, a geopolitical fight against the Kafir and socialist Arab governments. He wanted to separate his work from Maktab al-Khidamat and work inside Afghanistan himself because that way he could make sure the money and the resources reached where he thought they were needed. And Leah Farrell asked this was when bin Laden went to work for the Sayyaf and started on some construction projects to improve the conditions near the front. And this took place after his visit to the area, where he saw for himself how poor the conditions were. Mustafa Hamid, yes. Leah Farrell. Bin Laden doesn't seem to have given up on his desire to start a separate Arab grouping, though, which he subsequently did in an area near Jaj, which that later became known as al-Masri. I'm just wondering how much the issue of corruption and squandered resources factored into the separation from Maktab al-Khidamat, and also how much it factored into resistance from some fighting against him separating from Maktab al-Khidamat. It seems to me that corruption initiatives that combating corruption and efforts to resist reform initiatives had a significant impact on the course of the jihad. Corruption seemed to have played a major role in the establishment of several groups, not only Malwali Mansour Taliban, but also Maktab al-Khidamat, which itself was inevitably corrupted. And that's because they put in these imbeciles in charge of the military committee, the widows committee, the media committee. And remember, the diagram of how the Maktab al-Khidamat was constructed would later on translate to how al-Qaeda was constructed, because they too had a shura council, a religious council, a military committee, a media committee, a widows committee, a finance committee. Yes, corruption played Mustafa Hamid. Yes, corruption played a very big role in the jihad and in the history of Arab and Afghan groups in the war against the Soviets, especially in Peshawar. It also played a very big role in Abu Abdallah's separation from Maktab al-Khidamat because separating from the corrupt was one of the reasons al-Qaeda was established after the victory at Jaj. And you have to think, had Maktab al-Khidamat not been corrupted, would al-Qaeda had been established at the al-Masada camp, and would bin Laden had traveled to the Sudan and created a group even further to fight against the far enemy. So much was involved regarding Maktab al-Khidamat, in which very few people tend to discuss. Okay, guys, that's the end of this chapter. And thank you for still taking interest and tuning in. Take care.